Welcome to this 8-step seascape watercolour tutorial. Let's get started. The first step, I've sketched the picture and I am going to paint the sky wet in wet. So I'm wetting the paper first with a large flat brush. So I'm starting off by squeezing the yellow ochre that I've loaded onto my size 8 brush and allowing it to drop onto the paper. And it almost looks more natural. And you get these beautiful skies. So this is the blue with a pinch of red, and I'm just allowing it to sort of blend with the other sort of red mixed with the blues, and just tilting and just seeing what happens. Again, I haven't actually touched the surface with the brush except to wet the paper, that is. And again, I am squeezing my brush hairs to allow the paint to fall on to the wet surface. And I am tilting again. This colour is slightly darker, and I'm putting this sort of slightly darker colour at the top, and the top of the sky is nearest to us. So if you use a darker colour there, it will create more depth, because the sky that's on top of us and that's nearest to us will be stronger in tonal value. So in the distance, if your colours are paler, it will look further away, and it's quite a good artistic tool to use. So as you saw there, I've added some more of that lovely sort of blue mixed with the Winsor Red, and I'm just teasing now a little bit of that blue with a touch of red to the side, allowing it to kind of push off at the side and run into the painting there. And I've decided to mix up a little bit more of the Ultramarine with a pinch of the Winsor Red, and I'm dropping that in top left there, a little bit more, excuse my hand, and I am tilting that, allowing it to run into the painting there. So I'm adding another little bit of the Ultramarine puddle and allowing it to sort of flow towards the centre there as I am tilting. I felt the paint wasn't moving fast enough, so I've actually added just water, really, really wet water. Water is wet, but it's a big puddle of water, so it's running into my damp paint, and it sort of diluted it. I lost a little bit of control, but I kind of like doing stuff like that and just seeing what happens. For step 2, I'm going to paint the sea wet in wet. So I'm using some wax here at the water's edge, and what that does, if you rub a little bit of candle wax or this wax crayon sort of around the edge of the water, it will resist the paint, and you're kind of reserving the light and white of the paper. So again, I'm wetting the paper with my flat 1-inch brush, all of this sea area right up to the edge of the rocks there. I'm loading my brush with the Cerulean and yellow ochre wash. It's quite pale, and I'm painting the further bit of the sea wet into wet, coming into the middle of the sea. I've gone with that more aqua colour, the Cerulean and Viridian, painting it in the foreground but also a little bit in the distance there, all wet into wet, using that sort of limey green colour there, painting it wet into wet in the foreground. And I am tilting now, allowing the paint to blend and mix on the paper. Dripping in a little bit more of the Cerulean with the yellow ochre wash, painting it wet in wet around the sort of edge of the shoreline there, using my size 8 round brush. Painting a little bit more of the Cerulean and yellow ochre wash just around the horizon area. The paint had run away from this, so I'm just adding a little bit more paint, wet into wet with my size 8 brush. I'm also adding some of that colour wet into wet in the foreground area over that limey green colour, just painting here and there, wet into wet. I'm mixing up here some ultramarine with a pinch of that Winsor Red to make a sort of a blue-violet colour. I'm taking the excess paint off on my paper towel, so I'm painting damp into wet, just where I can see some sort of shadows and darks in the water here and there. Loading my brush again and just painting damp into damp around the edge of the shoreline there. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Step 3, I'm going to paint the sand wet into wet. I'm going to use some Brusho and watercolour pencils. So I've painted a yellow ochre wash wet on dry onto the beach area, and I have spattered some burnt sienna wet into wet onto the sand area. I'm using some light brown Brusho. I'm going to sprinkle it on to the wet sandy area to create colour and texture. I've pierced a hole into the lid of the Brusho and I'm tapping the base so that some of the Brusho falls out onto the wet surface. Remember, in Brusho, less is more. If you don't have Brusho, don't worry. I'm using a watercolour pencil and sandpaper, and I am rubbing the tip of the pencil onto the sandpaper, and the pigment of the pencil falls onto the wet surface and it creates texture and detail. For step 4, I'm going to paint the distant land, which is the Isle of Wight, and the Needles and the lighthouse. I'm wetting the land first of all, and I'm going to paint this wet into wet. I'm not wetting the sort of white cliff part there at the bottom. I will put some sort of shadow colours on there later. So I'm just using my size 8 brush to wet the surface. I'm using a very pale, dilute ultramarine with a pinch of Winsor Red here, and painting some of the dark marks on the cliffs. I've loaded my brush and I'm painting the ultramarine mixed with the cerulean and yellow ochre wash. So it's really quite cool, neutral colour that recedes and looks much further away. Using the cerulean now with the Viridian wash, painting the land as it goes towards the left. I've added a pinch of Winsor Red and I've mixed some cerulean with that, and I'm just really changing the colour slightly just to vary them. They're still quite cool colours that recede and will create depth in your painting. Just adding a little bit more of the ultramarine, cerulean and yellow ochre wash here, and I've decided to get rid of a little bit of those white cliffs, rinsing my brush and just diluting that colour and blending it away so you don't have this hard edge there where it goes from the land into the white cliffs, because it kind of brings it forward too much, and that's why I've softened that area to push it back. And I'm just adding and blending here on the white cliffs and painting some of the cerulean, ultramarine and yellow ochre wash at the bottom of each of the needles there, and painting a little bit of shadow on the top of those cliffs as well. I'm mixing up a dilute Winsor Red using my size 4 brush, taking the excess paint off there on my paper towel, and I'm painting the lighthouse. There's only 2 red parts here, and because it's so small you can't really see it even in the photograph, but it's just to bring a little bit of attention here without bringing it forward too much. For step 5, I'm painting the groins wet on dry using a mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm using my size 4 round brush. So these are much further away, so I've added a little bit of water to the wash to make it lighter, so the tonal value is slightly lighter. And as I paint the next one, I'll add a little bit more paint to make it slightly darker, and for the one nearest to us I'll make it darker still, and that really will create depth in the painting. As paler colours and tonal values recede, darker ones come forward. So take your time with this. So I'm just painting reflections here in the sea, wet on dry with my size 4 brush, a very watered down ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna. Using a little bit more ultramarine here, taking the excess off, I'm just going to paint a little bit of a stronger tonal value here, and just painting damp into damp, this slightly darker colour, adding a touch more burnt sienna to the ultramarine, and just adding a few more darker reflections. Just adding a little bit of yellow ochre mixed with a pinch of burnt sienna and painting that into the sea area for some warmer reflections here and there, going back in with the ultramarine and just painting a little bit more of the reflections here and there. Just painting this post now with a little bit of burnt sienna with a pinch of ultramarine wet on dry, and painting the same colour for reflections and adding a little bit of Paynes grey, damp into damp, top and bottom, and just adding a touch more darker reflection there using the ultramarine and burnt sienna. Mixing up here a very dilute burnt sienna with a pinch of ultramarine and just painting some darker marks now in the water. And as you saw there, I rinsed my brush and I'm just softening those marks there and just sort of pulling it through that bottom of that post there. So it really does look like the post is in the water and you've got the reflection around it. So just painting a few more marks here and there. So just loading my brush with that ultramarine there, and you can have a pinch of burnt sienna or even a pinch of Winsor Red. So it just greys up the blue a little bit. So I've painted it wet on dry on the sea, and as you saw there, I rinsed my brush, took the excess water off my brush on the side of the pot. I've done that again, and I'm blending those marks and softening them at the bottom. So it just pushes them back, but it kind of looks like sort of gentle sort of marks in the sea there, especially in the foreground area. So I'm just going to continue on there, making these marks and then blending with a clean, damp brush. For step 6, I'm going to paint the rocks using a plastic store card, and I'm also going to use some wax as well. So I'm actually just sort of rubbing on the sort of rocks here using the wax, and it's just to create some resist. I've already got paint here and Brusho and watercolour pencil, so the wax kind of helps protect, reserve that as well, but it'll also create some lighter areas because I'm going to be painting these dark rocks. So I'm using my flat brush, loading the brush, and I've actually had to mix up more paint because I seem to run out very quickly. So do mix up big puddles of paint. So again, mixing up the ultramarine and burnt sienna just to apply this dark paint, sort of wet on dry in areas, but also in other areas, damp into damp. The smaller rocks, I'm just using the sort of tip of the brush there and applying some of the black and ultramarine mix as well. And I'm just varying the sort of marks that I'm using. You don't have to paint the exact rocks that are in the photograph, it's just to give an impression. So I'm just painting in that violet, ultramarine and burnt sienna colour. So you've got all these sort of delicious different darks, mixing up a little bit more of the black and ultramarine, touch of water, and just painting this dark here and there with a flat brush, damp into damp. I've swapped now to my size 8 round brush and I'm applying this dark now, wet on dry, to the smaller rocks. I felt with the flat brush I couldn't have the control here, and I want these sort of small intricate rocks. So all these colours here you want to allow to sort of just sort of dry off a little bit. You want the sheen to still be on the surface of the paper before you start lifting off with your card. And what I would say is do practice using the plastic card to swipe these rocks before you do so. So here goes. So I'm just using the corner of the card and I'm lifting off the paint. If the paint doesn't lift off, it's either dried or it's too wet and it all runs back in on itself. So either wait for it to dry a little bit longer, or you may need to spritz your painting with a spritzer bottle. But as you can see here, I'm just swiping and it creates textures, light, and you get some of that underpainting coming through, but also darks as well. And as you can see there, the wax has done its job. It's created light and texture here and there. Try to just swipe one area once. Don't keep going back and forth because you could actually scuff your watercolour paper or even tear it. So for step 7, I'm just simply going to spritz and spatter the rocks. So I'm spritzing just to soften everything. Now you don't have to do this, you may like the rocks the way they are, but I quite like just to soften everything, get everything looking sort of more natural, as you can see here. And I'm finishing off this stage with a spatter of white gouache. You can use white watercolour to create soft lights at the edge of the shoreline. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. What I'm doing now is I'm spattering wet on dry with the white paint. I'm also going to add white to some yellow ochre to create some light sandy areas, especially if you've lost your lights. So I'm concentrating on the shoreline there to create light texture and a bit of sparkle as well. So I've added some yellow ochre to the white gouache and I'm spattering with my size 8 brush just here and there over the rocks to create light texture and some colour as well. So I'm removing the washi tape to reveal a white border. Now this gives me an opportunity to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. And I do decide to add some white gouache just to the edge of the land in the distance because some of that paint still crept down. So I'm just sort of painting this wet on dry with my size 4 brush just to smooth out any of those marks there. It's always handy to have a tube of white at the end of a painting just to get back the light and just to kind of hide some of those little errors here and there. Adding a little bit of white to the top of each of the needles there as well, and a touch more white paint here where the paint crept down. I'm adding some white here with this little post just at the bottom and on the edge of the rocks. This is kind of almost a dry brush effect. I've hardly got any water with this white gouache. It's literally straight from the tube with my damp brush. I'm just applying a little bit to the shoreline here as well. A few little squiggly lines, wet on dry. And I'm painting reflections here with my size 4 brush, wet on dry with a mixture of ultramarine with a pinch of the burnt sienna. I'd actually forgotten to paint them earlier. And here is my finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I thoroughly enjoyed it, especially painting that foreground with the Brusho and the watercolour pencil, the wax, the card swiping and the spattering. If you would like to support the content that I publish here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials and line drawings. More details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.